Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and we're continuing our series with Calvin versus Luther. And the way I set up this series initially was to quote from John Calvin's work on the Council of Trent with Antidote some assertions he made that's clearly fictitious, namely that it was the Council of Trent who raised these books, which Catholics called the Deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament and Protestants called the Apocrypha, that Trent raised these books to new canonical heights, and they enjoyed an authority that they never before had before. And Trent did this in order to supply new support for Catholic teaching. And this is clearly counterfactual. And case in point, Martin Luther himself. And that's what we're doing in this series. We're looking at Martin Luther prior to his rejection of Second Maccabees at the Second Leipzig Disputation of 1519. And we're looking at his theological controversies he had up to this point and seeing how Martin Luther actually held on to the Augustinian canon. He adduced the Deuterocanon in theological debate. He used it to serve as proof. In other words, he substantiated his doctrinal points with Deuterocanonical text. And as we're going to see in this episode, he even implies that he's using the Deuterocanon canonically. So we're going to look at that. This has been a fun series. I hope you've been enjoying it. So fasten your seatbelts, folks, because the Apocrypha Apocalypse begins right now. All right, so this has been a really fun series. In the last video, if you missed it, you need to check it out, because in the last video, we actually looked at Martin Luther himself using deuterocanonical or so-called apocryphal text to support and confirm doctrinal points he made in defense of his 95 Thesis. That's right, folks. He used the Old Testament Deuterocanon to confirm doctrinal points in his 95 Thesis. And that's in a work that we call the Resolutions on the Disputation Concerning the Power of Indulgences, that was made in April 1518. So if you haven't checked that video out, you definitely need to check it out, because lots of very interesting information there. And so in this video, I think this will be a shorter video, because we're going to look at a very important piece of information done not long after his resolutions. And we're going to look at his response to Sylvester Prierias, called A Dialogue Concerning the Power of the Pope. It was written in 1518. Again, we're coming up closer and closer to the 1519 July 8th date, where he famously condemned Second Maccabees as not canonical. Now, just like last episode, it's ironic to see Martin Luther using deuterocanonical books to support the 95 Thesis. In this episode, we're going to see him using another deuterocanonical book when he's dialoguing with a very important official known as Sylvester Macaloni di Prierio. So let's look a little bit in this. After Luther's publication of the 95 Thesis, word was sent to Rome to prohibit Luther from preaching against indulgences. So in February, Pope Leo X handed the matter over to the head of Luther's order, and a formal response was given by Sylvester Macaloni di Prierio, which is probably better known today simply as Prierias. In June 1518, Prierias issued his dialogue against Martin Luther's presumptuous theses concerning the power of the Pope. This was a hard-hitting and a bit dismissive and, quite frankly, surface attack on certain assertions made by Martin Luther. And there's a couple of things we need to point out in Prierias's initial document. See, Luther's reply to Prierias represents a significant turning point in the reformers' thought. Prierias introduced into the indulgence debate the question of the status and authority of the Pope, not in his administrative capacity as possessor of the keys or of the treasury of the saints, but as the defender of the church's rule of faith. This question was introduced most clearly in its methodological preconditions or fundamenta, with which Prierias prefaced his first work. Prierias's work is founded on a particular methodological precondition. And what is that? Well, Lowes says, quote, Prierias not only represented the view of infallibility to which some gave expression towards the close of the Middle Ages, but with his third proposition actually set the Roman Church over Scripture. Luther, therefore, proposes a different foundation in his response to Prierias, from which he would prosecute his case, namely, that the canonical scriptures only, that is, the canonical scriptures alone, being oracular, are therefore the only inerrant authority. All other teachings, since they are potentially fallible, must be judged by Scripture. And this is essentially the teaching what comes to be known as sola scriptura, or the Bible alone. So you can hear in this definition, this ringing out this idea of sola scriptura, the canonical scriptures are the only oracular type writings and therefore the only inerrant authority. And so everything falls under the judgment of Scripture. Now, fortunately, in this disputation, Luther did something that he also did in his resolutions, and that is he followed the format that's commonly given in the schools when debating a point, namely that they have a brief declaration of principles or methods upon which he's going to prosecute his arguments. So we saw in the resolutions prior to this, the same kind of declaration where he gives the idea of prima scriptura. It wasn't quite as strict as what we're going to see here with Prierias, namely that Scripture is the first among authorities, and so therefore it has a place of primacy, especially when confirming doctrine. Now, when Luther replies to Prierias, because Prierias kind of gave a dismissive and somewhat hasty surface reply to Luther, Luther decided to do the same thing to him. And so in his reply to Prierias, he gives a really quick declaration. So let's read it because it's very important. He says, quote, I pass by your foundations, whose meaning I guess rather than comprehend. And after your own example, I find it necessary to lay down some on my part. First is that St. Paul, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, prove all things, hold fast to what is good. And Galatians 1, but though we or an angel from heaven preach another gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. Second is that of St. Augustine to Jerome. I have learned to give honor alone to those books which are called canonical, and I firmly believe that no scripture of them errs. However, as far as the rest, however much doctrine and sanctity they contain, I do not likewise believe them to be true, unquote. So let's break it down really quick. Okay, first, just as I laid out, Prierias gave his foundations for his methodology, and that is that the church's authority is the highest authority. And as Lowes characterized it, that the church even has authority over the sacred scripture. I haven't been able to actually read the original document from Prierias, and so I can't really assess whether Lowes' point is valid or not. But for the sake of argument, we'll just concede it, that let's say that is exactly what he did. That would make sense why Luther responded the way he did. And because he says he's going to lay down his fundamental principles. And this is where he lays down sola scriptura. He quotes Paul in Thessalonians about holding on to what's good, Galatians 1, that even if an angel from heaven preaches another gospel than what has been preached, let him be accursed. But the most important part, as you can guess, is the second point, namely that of St. Augustine in his letter to Jerome, and which says, I have learned to give honor alone to those books which are called canonical. And I highlighted that because that is the earmark, that canonical scripture alone is capable of correction, teaching, refutation, according to his fundamental principles. And he believes that these scriptures do not err. At least he's quoting Augustine to that effect. And however, as for the rest, however much doctrine and sanctity they contain, I do not likewise believe them to be true. And I imagine he says in the same way he believes the scriptures to be true. By the way, if you want my opinion on that, I actually did a assessment where I said Calvin was right. And I look at some aspects where, yeah, actually, Luther, I think, was right in that, at least that sacred scripture, by virtue of its inspiration, does indeed have a primacy to it. However, I would not go as far as to say that it alone is an infallible authority, because there can be infallible authorities that's not inspired. But that's beside the point. Now, earlier in the very beginning of the series, I quoted from an article by H.H. Haworth, who is a non-Catholic historian and theologian. And he noted earlier that Luther states that he's giving honor alone to those books which are called canonical. And yet, in the same work, Haworth notes that Luther references Tobit 3:24. When I put out my first edition of Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger, I was unable to confirm and look deeper into this. So instead, I just quoted Haworth and left it at that. And I had pretty good confidence that what Haworth said is true, simply because I'm familiar with his work, and he is a very, very solid researcher. He really does stick to the primary source material, and he gives all the references and so on. So I was very confident. But since for this series and for this academic article that I'm writing, by the way, this series is based loosely on that academic article. I looked up the reference and did a quick quotation. And yes, indeed, Luther does quote, or at least he references Tobit 3:24 in the Vulgate, and he appears to be using this with canonical weight. So I agree now. I can confirm Haworth is correct, that Luther says he's going to give honor to canonical books alone, and he's certainly using Tobit in a canonical way. So let's look at the quotation. Quote, thirdly, that even if it were true, souls were redeemed by indulgences, by what dialectic have you learned? By the same lament satisfied for the souls by which it was done, by whose grace forgiveness is granted. Divination in this way about those most abstruse things, as if you saw everything present. Could it not happen that while he was tossing the coin, the angel, in the meantime, as he did to Tobias, offered to God a memory of his deed, and then visits the soul and redeems it by interceding some delay? Or something else happened that we do not know? So let's break this apart a little bit. It is a little cryptic, and this isn't the best translation, but if anybody has a better translation, it's not available in English. So this is my own. So it's a little chunky. Please, I value your insights if you can give me some help. But by the way, I provided the Latin for you, so you can work that out for yourself. Maybe you can come up with a better explanation. But what's going on here is that Prierias very confidently asserts certain things happen after death. And he does so with such confidence that Luther here is basically saying, how do you know? Right. So when he says divination in this way about those most abstruse things, as if you saw everything present, what he's saying there is that, somehow you have some sort of special insight when, as if you know these things that really we don't know a lot about. Then he introduces, could it not happen that while he was tossing the coin, the angel, in the meantime, just as he did to Tobias, offers the God memory of this deed, and then visits the soul and redeems it by interceding some delay? Okay. So, in other words, what Luther's doing is he's using this text from Tobit, which speaks about the angel offering a memorial sacrifice before God. He's using this as a defeater for Prierias' confidence that he knows exactly what transpires after death. So, given the oracular and inerrant character of the canonical scriptures, the fact that an angel could make an offering, as it did in Tobit, is asserted as if it's beyond doubt and a live option. Thereby, Luther's counter scenario becomes a potential defeater to Prierias' confidence asserting about the afterlife. So Luther's use of Tobit in this context coheres with what we've seen so far in his use of deuterocanonical books. So he's using it as a live option, and if it's a live option, then it's just as plausible as Prierias' assessment, and therefore it's a defeater. Now that speaks to me that he's using Tobit as having canonical weight. Think about it. If he was just drawing from a story in the Apocrypha about angel offering this sacrifice and redeeming the soul or whatever, that would have no weight in his assertion. In fact, it would probably make him look a little silly. I mean, really? That's what you come up with? Is you can't come up with an actual scriptural canonical example or counter example, I should say, in this case? You have to repair to something that no one believes has authority? No, that just doesn't make sense. Clearly, he believes Tobit is inspired and canonical scripture, and he's using it as such. But we can add more. Like I mentioned, the other part of this argument is that we see here in his reply to Prierias that Luther's use of Tobit coheres perfectly with what we've seen in all the other previous disputations. Luther is adducing a text from the Deuterocanon, and he's using it with canonical weight to confirm a doctrine. Okay. And we can assert now with confidence that he does believe it to be canonical because of that initial declaration of methods that he gives at the beginning that we quoted, because he's only going to give honor alone to the canonical books. As mentioned earlier, also, Augustine is affirmed as well in the declaration. And this is important. Of course, Martin Luther's an Augustinian monk. It's not surprising that he would quote Augustine. But it's interesting he quotes Augustine authoritatively in the declaration in regards to the canonical books. Because which books did St. Augustine believe were canonical? Well, all you have to do is look on his work on Christian doctrine, and he tells you which books are canonical. And lo and behold, you have the 7 deuterocanonical books that were affirmed at Trent. So by him citing Augustine's letter to Jerome, and specifically with Augustine's mention of canonical works, this also seems to affirm that at this point in Luther's career, that he holds on to the canonical scriptures, the same canonical scriptures that were affirmed in the North African councils of Hippo Regius and the Carthaginian councils that were affirmed by Pope Innocent I and subsequent popes, that was affirmed at the Council of Florence and ultimately affirmed at the Council of Trent. So I mean, it clearly places him in the camp of Augustine, both in his use of Tobit, his use of Augustine, and again, this coheres perfectly with everything we've seen so far in this series. Now, if we stopped our survey here with the reply to Prierias, I would say we have substantial evidence that Martin Luther believed these books to be canonical scripture, had the full weight of scripture, and this is all prior to his denial of Second Maccabees in 1519. But there's more. Yes, there is, folks. There is even more. So when we come back at the next episode, we're going to go to yet another theological controversy. And this one is his recounting of his meeting with the special papal envoy, Cardinal Cajetan, Thomas de Vio. And so we're going to look at the proceedings at Augsburg that took place November 25th, 1518. And we're going to see something also quite surprising. We're going to see Martin Luther using the Deuterocanon, not just using it, but correcting the Pope as to the true meaning of a deuterocanonical work. So that's worth tuning in one more time. So if you like this series, you like the videos on this channel, please thumbs up, subscribe, smash the bell, tell your friends about it, leave comments in the comments section. All those things help us with the algorithm to get this channel and this information out to the people that need it. And until next time, I am Gary Machuda. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye, everyone.